Occupational injury and disease is a worldwide dilemma. In Canada, there are precautions employers and safety professionals take to prevent such tragedies. But in developing countries, this isn't always possible. We sat down with Marianne Levitsky, the president of Workplace Health Without Borders, to learn about some common hazards around the globe and what can be done to help the cause.
The International Labour Organization, the ILO, estimates that 2.34 million people a year die from work-related illness and injury. Most of those are from disease. And that occupational disease costs the world $2.8 trillion US a year. In Canada, there's many things employers do in terms of protection. We talk about the hierarchy in terms of engineering controls, personal protective equipment, eliminating hazards. But in developing countries, it can be very different because the kinds of controls that we use here that we're so familiar with, for example, local exhaust ventilation, it can be a big barrier to install that in a country where they don't have the money for the equipment. The materials may not be readily available, and most important, the power to run it is very expensive. So one of the things we want to do is to look at alternative arrangements where, say, it can run on solar power or some other kind of power, but just be low power demand, so that they can have some of the controls that we're so used to here.
For example, silica is a common material that triggers work-related illnesses and causes other diseases to increase in severity.
Silica is something that's actually in sand, so by itself it's not a big problem, but it is a problem when it gets into the air and it gets ground into very, very, very fine dust and it's breathed in, and then it can go down deep into the lungs and it causes some really terrible diseases. It can cause cancer, it can cause silicosis, which is the scarring of the lungs, so ultimately people can't breathe and then they die because they can't breathe. And it also makes tuberculosis worse. So TB or tuberculosis is a major worldwide concern, but what's not known is that many people get it because they're exposed to silica.
In Canada, there are protections in place for workers who are dealing with hazards. Unfortunately, this isn't the case in other parts of the globe.
In developing countries, the things that we take for granted are often very difficult to get. For one thing, a lot of the workforce in developing countries are in the informal sector. In other words, they don't work directly for an employer. There's no controls on their exposure. They're exposed to some really toxic materials. We have to be concerned about where the materials we wear and use are produced and the conditions under which they're produced. And then when we're finished using them, we have to be concerned about where they're going and how they're being disposed of and recycled.